Silence. I could barely hear my own breathing, a sharp ache stabbing my lungs with every cold breath I drew. My eyes were closed, but the moments came alive in my mind. I felt every step. I was marching alongside Napoleon, a foot soldier in the Grand Army, across those vast, desolate lands. The distant boom of cannons in my ears, the scent of gunpowder and burnt flesh in my nostrils. This wasn't just a historical narrative. It was the chilling rebirth of a winter nightmare. It was June of 1812. The scorching sun made our wool uniforms feel even heavier. We stood on the bank of the Niemen River. Before us lay Russia, a vast land stretching into the unknown. Green plains extended as far as the eye could see, disappearing into the horizon. But we knew that this verdant landscape would soon be stained with blood and mud. Emperor Napoleon, astride his horse, stood like a statue in his famous gray coat. In his eyes was the familiar determination of the man who had brought all of Europe to its knees. But perhaps, for the first time, there was a faint glint of uncertainty. Around him, generals, staff officers, each chasing their own ambitions and the emperor's genius. I was just a foot soldier, a small part of that massive army. The weight of my rifle rested on my shoulder, a mix of excitement and fear filling me. The emperor's ambition was grand, to compel Tsar Alexander I to cease trade with British merchants, thereby forcing Great Britain to end the war. The official reason was to protect Poland from the Russian threat. The emperor had named this the Second Polish War. Perhaps the magic of that name would conceal the hardships awaiting us, offering some relief to the Europe we left behind. After all, this was a war of liberation for our Polish brethren. But deep down, we knew this was nothing more than another move to solidify the emperor's undisputed hegemony in Europe. We were an immense army, numbering approximately 449,000 soldiers. This number included not only the French, but also Italians, Germans, Poles, Dutch. Men gathered from all corners of Europe, speaking different languages, holding different beliefs, but united under the same flag. Each of us had our own dreams, our own fears. Some sought glory, others merely wished to survive. For many like me, it was simply the emperor's command, an unquestionable destiny. Horses neighed, cannons groaned, and the roar of the colossal army filled the air. These sounds heralded the birth of one of humanity's largest armies. The river crossing was near Kaunas. In the dead of night, under the flickering light of torches, 3 pontoon bridges were constructed. The emperor himself supervised the locations where the bridges would be built. He demanded perfection. Then, dismounting, he took lodging in a tent, watching as the entire army crossed the Niemen under his watchful eye. As we crossed those bridges, it felt as though we were passing through the maw of a giant. The creak of the wooden planks beneath our feet, the rhythmic steps of thousands of soldiers, the gurgling of the water. It was an unforgettable moment. The roads in this region of Lithuania were mere dirt tracks winding through dense forests. At first, everything seemed to be going well, but as the days passed, our supply lines began to fail to keep up with our arduous march. Food wagons and ammunition carts fell behind. We, bringing up the rear, suffered the most from shortages. Hunger had begun to gnaw at us, even before the fighting truly began. On June 25th, the emperor had crossed the Niemen. We followed close behind. Murat's cavalry led the way, their horses' hooves pounding the earth, raising clouds of dust. Behind them came Napoleon's and Davout's elite units. Our march was grueling. The sky suddenly darkened. Clouds like a steel ceiling settled over us. Then torrential rain poured down, turning the roads into mud within minutes. Our striped uniforms were soaked through. Raindrops streamed down our faces. Our boots sank up to our knees in mud, every step becoming torture. The cold penetrated to our very bones. The rain showed no signs of stopping, but then Suddenly, everything changed. The clouds dispersed, the sky cleared, and a scorching heat descended upon us. Our bodies that had shivered yesterday were now drenched in sweat. Our mud-caked uniforms clung to us, burning every inch of our skin. The central group, personally led by the Emperor, covered 110 kilometers in 2 days. This wasn't just a march. It was a test of endurance. We were exhausted, our mouths parched, our feet blistered. We would have given anything for a few sips of water, a piece of dry bread, but the Emperor's gaze was fixed forward. There was no stopping. As we advanced towards Vilnius, we heard that the Russian army was retreating. News spread rapidly. The Russians, under the command of Barclay de Tolly, were employing a scorched earth tactic to prevent their capital from falling. We could hardly believe our ears. Were they really setting fire to their own villages, their own fields, their own homes? What kind of stubbornness was this? What kind of animosity? As we approached the city, the smell of burning stung our nostrils. 10,000 horse carcasses lay stretched along the roadside. Horses that had died of hunger, or had been butchered by desperate soldiers. This sight slowly began to kill the hope within us. When we entered the city, the streets were empty, the doors of houses wide open. Only a deathly silence prevailed. Traditionally, in a conquered city, governors or dignitaries would offer the keys to protect their people and property. But here, only empty houses and the smell of burning greeted us. Vilnius had become a ghost town. Supplies were hard to come by in Lithuania. The land was heavily forested, and agriculture was almost non-existent. Even the supplies coming from Poland were insufficient. The 2-day forced march had made matters worse. Supply wagons couldn't keep up with us, and we faced ammunition shortages. Our arsenals were far behind. Gunpowder to load our rifles, even a single loaf of bread to fill our bellies, was a luxury. Under these harsh conditions, desertions began. Especially soldiers from Spain and Portugal couldn't endure these circumstances. For them, this war had lost its meaning. Deserters looted everything they could get their hands on, terrorizing the local population. The areas the Grand Army passed through were devastated. A Polish officer reported that all the inhabitants of the surrounding lands had abandoned their homes. Every village we saw in the countryside was deserted, every field burned. This left us even more helpless. The Russian cavalry, the Cossacks, were a true menace. Light, fast, and ruthless. Our French light cavalry was shocked by them. The Emperor ordered the infantry to support the cavalry. However, this negatively affected our reconnaissance and intelligence operations. Despite having 30,000 cavalrymen, we had lost contact with Barclay's army. We couldn't pinpoint the enemy's location and kept sending out scouting parties, but they often returned empty-handed. Lost soldiers became prey for the Cossacks. Upon reaching Vilnius, the Emperor still hoped that Alexander would ask for peace, but he was mistaken. The Tsar was determined to fight rather than surrender. Barclay decided that the unification of the First and Second Armies was more important and continued his retreat towards Drissa. This retreat was dragging us deeper into Russia, into the embrace of an unknown fate. As the Russians retreated eastward, we encountered no major obstacles, apart from occasional skirmishes on their rearguard. However, this retreat was working against our usual tactics of swift and decisive victories. Forced marches led to desertions and starvation. Fatigue, weariness, and despair settled over the army like a nightmare. Soldiers were exposed to diseases and contaminated water, typhus, dysentery. These had become more dangerous enemies than bullets. The loss of thousands of horses in the logistics column worsened the situation. When horses died, artillery units had to abandon their cannons and cavalrymen their mounts. Our heavy cannons became stuck in the mud. These were symbols of our strength, now abandoned, destined to rust. Approximately 50,000 deserters formed lawless bands. waging guerrilla warfare against the local peasants, further weakening our supply lines. The once noisy and disciplined Grand Army had shrunk to just 95,000 soldiers at this point. This was less than a fifth of our initial colossal strength. The concern on the Emperor's face was contagious. Barclay, despite all of Bagratión's insistence, refused to engage in a major battle. Although he repeatedly tried to establish a strong defensive position, the rapidly advancing French forces compelled him to retreat. The Russian scorched earth policy exacerbated our supply problems. This tactic, proposed by Karl Ludwig von Fall, stunned us. We couldn't comprehend a will that would burn its own land and harm its own people. This was a type of enemy we had never encountered before. Barclay's stubborn retreat infuriated the Russian nobility. Whispers rose in the court. Finally, he was dismissed, and Mikhail Illarionovich Kutuzov was appointed in his place. This was a glimmer of hope for the Russian people, but for us, a new unknown. However, Kutuzov continued his predecessor's strategy, not pushing his army into a major engagement except for a few defensive skirmishes. The Russian army continued to retreat deeper into Russia, towards Moscow. It was as if they were drawing us further into a deadly trap. On August 16th to 18th, we won the Battle of Smolensk. Fierce fighting took place, and blood flowed through the city streets. The Russians resisted, but were eventually forced to withdraw. However, as the city burned, the decisive victory we had hoped for did not materialize. Once again, the enemy had slipped through our grasp. Standing amidst the ashes of Smolensk, I clearly saw the disappointment on the Emperor's face. This city should have been a turning point for us, but it became just another stop. The Emperor abandoned his plans to set up camp in Smolensk. Now, the only objective was Moscow. We continued to pursue the Russian forces, pushing forward with our exhausted bodies. We knew that Kutuzov had no intention of surrendering Moscow without a fight. Finally, on September 7, 1812, approximately 110 kilometers west of Moscow, near the town of Borodino, we encountered the Russian army. This would be the bloodiest day of the Napoleonic Wars. There was tension in the air. Everyone knew this battle would change everything. It was early morning. The air was foggy, and the sounds of cannons and soldiers' shouts echoed through the mist. More than 250,000 soldiers fought, and the fields were drenched in blood. Hundreds of thousands of men clashed, rifles fired, swords clanged, bayonets gleamed. The smell of blood, mud, and gunpowder filled the air. The fortifications the Russians called Raevsky Redoubt and Bagratión Flèches became blood-soaked hills. Cannon fire tore trees from their roots, shredding horses and men. We achieved a tactical victory, taking control of the battlefield, but we failed to annihilate the Russian army. We lost thousands of our soldiers and 49 high-ranking officers. The cries of the wounded echoed across the battlefield, but there was no one to help them. Hundreds of doctors could not treat thousands of wounded. The next day, the Russians managed to slip away under the cover of darkness. The decisive victory the Emperor desired had, once again, eluded us. Only destruction and death remained in our wake. A week later, on September 14th, we entered Moscow. A strange feeling came over me. We were entering the Russian capital, but the cries of victory were silent. The Emperor expected to be greeted by a delegation at the city gates, as was customary. But there was no one. The city streets were empty, the doors of houses wide open. Only a deathly silence reigned. The city's governor, Fyodor Rostopchin, had ordered all supplies to be removed from the city, prisoners to be released, and key locations to be set on fire. We encountered an empty, burnt-smelling city. Traditionally, in a conquered city, governors or dignitaries would offer the keys to protect their people and property. The Emperor's face showed deep disappointment at being deprived of a traditional victory. The taste of victory was bitter. Every soldier had to fend for himself, which further weakened the already exhausted army's discipline. On the first night, a fire broke out in the marketplace. The dry wooden buildings, aided by the wind, quickly turned into a ball of flames. We had no means to fight the fire. There were no hoses, no fire brigades, and water sources were scarce. Later that night, fires also broke out in the outer districts. Although initially thought to be due to soldiers' carelessness, it later became clear that Rostopchin had left behind a small police unit tasked with burning the city to ashes. Houses were furnished with flammable materials, fire pumps had been dismantled, and fuses were scattered throughout the city to ignite the flames. Despite all efforts by French authorities, 4/5 of the city burned down. The sky was crimson, and smoke could be seen for miles. Moscow was turning to ashes in the emperor's hands. The emperor had expected Tsar Alexander to surrender at Poklonaya Hill upon the capture of Moscow, the spiritual capital of the country. But the Russian government had no intention of surrendering. We stayed in Moscow for a month, under worsening conditions. Supplies dwindled, and Russian attrition operations wore us down. The Cossacks lay in ambush at every turn, attacking supply convoys and capturing deserters. Remaining in the city was tantamount to suicide. The cold had also begun to set in. In mid-October, our only option was to withdraw from Moscow. The long retreat march had begun. This was not a victory march, but a struggle for survival. After the Battle of Maloy-Yaroslavets, Kutuzov forced the French army to use the Smolensk road, which had already been depleted of supplies by both armies. This was a perfect example of a scorched earth tactic. By closing the southern route, he prevented us from returning by another path. Partisan units, under Kutuzov's command, attacked the weakest points of the French column. When the retreating French column split into separate groups, Cossack cavalry attacked the isolated units. They haunted us like ghosts. At night, we would awaken to the sound of gunshots, then silence, and in the morning, we'd find the frozen body of a comrade beside us. The army's supply became impossible. Horses weakened due to lack of fodder or hay. Almost all of them either died of starvation or were killed by hungry soldiers. When horses died, cavalrymen had to proceed on foot, and cannons and wagons were abandoned. Our heavy artillery became stuck in the snow and mud. These were the symbols of our power. Now they were abandoned, destined to be rusty iron heaps. Due to hunger and disease, a large number of soldiers began to desert. The army, melting away day by day, was turning into a ghost. Many deserters were captured or killed by Russian peasants. We suffered heavy defeats at Vyazma, Polotsk, and Krasnoy. During the crossing of the Berezina River, we experienced hell. 2 Russian armies inflicted heavy casualties on the French army attempting to escape via pontoon bridges. Bridges collapsed, and hundreds of men fell into the icy waters and froze to death. Russian artillery from behind relentlessly fired upon us. The bridges across the river were covered with corpses. This was not a retreat. It was a massacre. In November 1812, the emperor learned of a coup attempt in France. This news further crushed our already plummeting morale. On December 5th, he abandoned his army and returned to France by sleigh, leaving command to Marshal Joachim Murat. Murat, in turn, departed within a few weeks to protect his kingdom of Naples, and command passed to Eugene de Beauharnais, Napoleon's former stepson. The emperor's departure left a strange void within us. Our leader was gone. We were left alone in Russia's cruel winter. The ever-shrinking Grand Army finally left Russian territory on December 14, 1812. The only things we left behind were frozen corpses beneath the snow, burned villages, and unspeakable pain. In total, over 380,000 French soldiers had lost their lives. This was not just a number. Each was a life, a family, a hope. Most of the Prussian units survived thanks to the Convention of Tarragon, which secured an armistice between Prussia and Russia. Almost all of the Austrian contingent under Karl Philipp successfully completed the retreat. The Russian government, meanwhile, formed the Russian-German Legion from German prisoners and deserters. This campaign marked a turning point for the Napoleonic Wars. Napoleon's reputation was severely damaged, and French hegemony in Europe was significantly weakened. The Grand Army lost most of its strength. The political changes triggered by this situation led Prussia and Austria to break the alliances they had been forced to maintain with France. As a result, the War of the Sixth Coalition erupted. The fate of Europe was being rewritten, but the cost was paid with unspeakable suffering. When I opened my eyes, I was drenched in cold sweat. That dream had once again taken me back to that harsh winter, to those bloody battlefields. I am certain that those listening to this story on a Sleep Story channel will feel, as I did, what it was like to be by Napoleon's side, to be a part of that colossal army, of those moments that changed the course of history.